Donald Trump is having a rough campaign closing, talking of violence against journalists this weekend, pantomiming a sex act on his microphone, and continuing the free fall since the Madison Square Garden rally put him on defense over all kinds of attacks and hateful jokes. Now, voters have been living through the impact of Trump's first term for some time. People lived through the COVID failures, the ensuing economic collapse, his failed coup, and these abortion bans around the nation. But there are many accounts that suggest Trump is not only basically tied with Harris, but that he could end this election with more support than before. His ceiling has been typically stuck around 46 or 46.8% in the past races. You can see there, both times he drew fewer votes than the Democrat running, but famously took the Electoral College with 46.1% in 2016. And Americans disapproved of Trump as president for his entire time in office. There were historic lows. He averaged about 41%. And I want to tell you, when he left in January 21, he was at a rock bottom 34%. Record lows. These are not numbers suggesting the public approved of him or wanted him at the time, let alone again. Yet, as Steve Kornacki has reported, and we saw these charts, the same nation that rejected him and saw him out the door at that 34% approval, now in surveys remembers that very same time more fondly. People now say in the United States that they give Trump's first term 48% approval. That's in the past tense, but it's far higher than the actual approval he had at the time. Now, memory is flexible, it's subjective. People thought less of Trump's first term during it, according to them. I'm telling you, their approval ratings, not the media's, not my view. But it's also been very choppy since then. People feel worse off than they did 4 years ago. The wrong track numbers in America are high, and when times are tough, it's common to look back for some better time. A type of political nostalgia, which is actually the exact messaging that conservatives have long been primed for. Ronald Reagan coined the MAGA slogan. You see it right there. Make America Great Again. Donald Trump later plagiarized it and added his more blunt appeals to the old days, from gender to race. So right now, our special report here heading into the election is, what are people forgetting about Trump in office? Now, he could tick up to 48% and still lose, or he could win the Electoral College, but any chance Trump has at winning Tuesday's votes rests on a pretty good number of people forgetting what I just mentioned, that they did not actually approve of his time in office during that time, which is usually the best indicator, not your faraway memories later. It's while they were living through it, in contrast to what may be these inflated sort of nostalgic numbers now. Now, those are the facts about the numbers. They're not partisan. Just as many warnings against Donald Trump from the beginning. Warnings that he was unfit, untrustworthy, divisive, and wholly opposed to the actual public service for the nation and sacrifice came not as a partisan attack, but from Republicans and from conservatives back when they were speaking freely before Trump's unexpected 2016 Electoral College victory. They were based on Trump's record over the years in business and public life. They weren't based on some liberal agenda or Biden-Harris campaign that was many years in the future. It is a fact, if you put aside all of the partisan harping and skepticism about where we hear things, it is simply a public fact that we lived through, that those Republicans made those warnings because we've never seen any figure in either party in the modern era draw such widespread condemnation.
He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot.
This man is a pathological liar.
The most vulgar person to ever aspire to the presidency.
I don't think he has a clue about anything.
The man cannot tell the truth, but he combines it with being a narcissist.
He's a chaos candidate, and he'd be a chaos president.
He's a populist, authoritarian narcissist.
Coming from a guy who is such a coward.
He has authoritarian rulings and interests and notions.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
Those are all Republicans, okay? His own running mate, the last voice you heard there, opposed him so much, he didn't just say, I'm a not Trump or an anti-Trump. He said he was never Trump, and then collapsed the meaning of the word never. And there are many more condemnations from progressives and liberals, from other types of critics, from government veterans, from nonpartisan experts. But maybe all these adjectives only go so far. There is also the facts of how Trump ran the government, how he used the power when he had it. Here are some of the documented examples. Trump failed to lead a competent COVID response. He rejected the medical leadership. He lied about the virus danger. And then he told people to drink bleach.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
Trump failed to also enact his own legislative agenda, the top items he had been pitching, from infrastructure to health care. He failed to build the wall he promised, which was the centerpiece of that first campaign. He then launched a chaotic travel ban with which courts limited. He used immigration powers to separate children from their own parents, something almost no parent and no free-thinking person says is a positive. He bent American policy towards Wall Street bankers after campaigning as a populist, from tax welfare to gutting consumer protections. He failed to appoint or maintain qualified officials. With so many people quitting or getting fired, he had the record of the worst turnover in modern American history. More on that in a moment. He was repeatedly caught abusing power for his own benefit, routing foreign and domestic government funds to himself and his companies, demanding prosecutions of his opponents, shaking down Ukraine to go after the Bidens. He staffed the courts in order to end Roe, paving the road for those Trump abortion bans. He used his bully pulpit to clearly coddle and equivocate on white supremacy at Charlottesville. He encouraged violent militias like the Proud Boys. He routinely divided and denigrated his fellow citizens. People know and remember that. Trump ran the most criminal operation since Nixon, who, of course, was run out of the White House. During one term in office, Trump has seen 20-some aides indicted, a dozen convicted, several incarcerated, and many more now awaiting trial, including his own most serious trial for federal felony offenses for the failed coup, which makes Trump the first president to ever thwart a peaceful transfer of power with an insurrection. And he lied hundreds of his own supporters into their conduct that day and later convictions and prison, even as he now very openly admits the lies because he lost the election.
I lost by one tenth of a point. But they say it was 22,000 votes.
Yes, he did lose narrowly. And he got a lot of people in trouble telling them to commit crimes, claiming he didn't lose. He knows he was the loser. Just like he knows vowing to pardon those traitors convicted of sedition is disloyal, literally the definition, disloyal to the United States. He doesn't care. Those are public facts. And that's just a small selection, which is why such a broad bipartisan group, unusual in American politics, we hear so much about our polarized politics. Why don't we hear more about this bipartisan coalition of people who oppose Trump returning to power? These people with different ideologies and policy views combine with one clear consensus. They say, they're telling you, that knowing all this, picking Donald Trump to be president again now would be like picking an anti-vaxxer as your doctor, which is actually what Trump says he'll basically do in government, embracing anti-vaxxer RFK Jr., who says he'll oversee doctors and health agencies in a Trump administration, helping Trump decide whether to ban vaccines that save lives. Hiring Trump would be like taking the closing pitch in your campaign to Latino and undecided voters and then opening up that night's closing argument address with a comic's racist material.
There's literally a floating island of garbage. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Picking Trump would be like hiring your own Nepo baby-in-law to tackle the Middle East with no diplomatic experience and then give that same nepotistic hire a complex assignment to deal with pandemic supplies without any experience. Hiring Trump again would be like hiring a renegade for your top national security post only to watch them get indicted, or hiring the Exxon chief to run all U.S. diplomacy so you could further fuse a capitalist oil agenda as America's foreign policy and then tell everyone you're draining the swamp. Hiring Trump again would be like hiring an energy department chief who backed abolishing the energy department, or hiring an attorney general who undermines the rule of law by blatantly politicizing cases, or trying to replace that attorney general with another acting AG so corrupt he ended up indicted. Hiring Trump again would be like picking a chief financial officer who does financial fraud, which Trump did. That's why his CFO went to jail. Or like vowing to drain the swamp and then hiring 4 different agency chiefs who then corruptly enrich themselves in a rush to grift and take taxpayer dollars, which is why each of these Trump appointees were actually forced to resign over their blatant and busted ethics scandals. Hiring Trump again would be like hiring for your top campaign lawyer a person who then is disbarred for election crimes and indicted in several states.
The call for Joe Biden isn't who was it called by? Oh my goodness, all the networks. Wow. All the networks. Let's have trial by combat.
It'd be like having your original campaign chairman hired to run a campaign so you are head of the government and enforcing the laws, and then that person's actually guilty of their own felonies, going to prison. Or it'd be like hiring as your longest-serving political consigliere and advisor someone ultimately convicted of federal felonies to hide your own history of conduct with them. It'd be like taking your longest-serving lawyer that you hire, but them actually being a criminal, imprisoned for election felonies on your behalf, or picking a new lawyer for another one of your trials who ends up being indicted, as you see Boris Epstein there was in the corner, and would need his own lawyer. It'd be like trying to hire a DOJ special prosecutor who, again, was supposed to enforce the law, who ends up convicted of election crimes for your benefit.
They used the machines to trash large batches of votes that should have been awarded to President Trump.
That there are enough facts that support this plea of guilty.
I do.
Hiring Trump again would be like picking an election fraud czar who's indicted for election fraud, which they also did, or hiring a campaign lawyer who's then convicted of campaign crimes and regrets ever working for you.
I would have declined to represent Donald Trump. I look back on this whole experience with deep remorse.
As the argument goes from, again, the very bipartisan coalition I showed you, putting Trump back in the White House now would be like hiring White House aides who would go to prison before cooperating with the federal government they literally took an oath to serve. Or like hiring aides who admit their plans were to overthrow the election results in a coup.
They put me in handcuffs, they bring me here, they put me in leg irons, they stick me in a cell.
It's a lot. The argument, the warning from these individuals is that hiring Trump again would be like rehiring the people who grifted after promising to drain the swamp. And even after going through this litany of mistakes and crimes tonight on election eve, when you see more of the Trump crime spree in one visual, it is galling and telling. Here, put together, are many of the stories I just alluded to, whether these people are fit to be hired. These lawyers now disbarred, indicted, convicted, not for other random activities, but all for what they did over time for Donald Trump, and convicted in fair processes in federal and state courts, in states red and blue, in independent probes and separate investigations with different prosecutors who don't coordinate in different states. And this crime spree that you see on your screen is just the 2020 campaign. 4 years was a long time ago. People may have put it out of their memories. But if you broaden out to both of Trump's prior campaigns and his business, you see a man convicted of fraud, atop 3 organizations rife with crime and convicts, a web of criminals around this one man on top. The common element is obvious: criminal enterprises as adjudicated by many separate juries of their peers, from the campaign to the business. It's a lot to even track, as we just did there for you, swiftly, let alone fully absorb. And so I'll tell you this. If you are watching this, or you share this with someone who's watching it who hasn't yet made up their mind, or is leaning Trump for certain reasons, it would be understandable that people with lives and obligations could forget all that. It's not your job to track all that. It's the job of, law enforcement, news media, government auditors. It'd be easy to forget how it went and felt and went during that time, and how all those failures and all those convicts, by definition, were interfering with the honest administration of the people's business. That may be part of why they didn't get some of their stuff done that I mentioned earlier. This report you're watching cited 19 of the worst offenders as determined by those independent probes and public reporting, and sometimes juries of their peers. There are many, many other Trump veterans we did not include. These people, at Trump's behest and repeated encouragement and defense, he in fact later pardoned some of them, these people violated their oaths to you, to the Constitution, to the United States government, and to the money, the taxpayer dollars of yours that they were dealing with. They violated the law to a criminal degree. It is quite literally the opposite of hiring the best and the brightest.
I know the best people. I know the best managers. I know the best deal makers. I know people that will make us so strong. I know guys that are so good.
We need to get the best and the finest, and if we don't, we'll be in trouble for a long period of time.
I know the best people.
Hiring Trump as president again would be like hiring those people. They are literally his people. And he is not saying he learned from those mistakes or wants to turn a page or try something different. Again, I'm just giving you the facts. He has been campaigning all year on doubling down on these people, embracing them, and saying he would go after anyone who gave them any accountability. And here's the thing. Elections are always a hiring decision. You've seen his decisions. You've seen who he hires and what he does. And if some people had forgotten it, this is the time to make sure you're remembering it accurately. So now you get to make your decision.